On the 1st of May in 1993, all of France received shocking news. Pierre Bérégovoy, a French politician who served as prime minister under President François Mitterrand, was dead. But it wasn't death due to natural causes. It was a far more gruesome death. The former prime minister had taken his own life with a revolver. No king, no president, no prime minister in modern French history had ever ended their life this way.
À Nevers, où Pierre Bérégovoy avait vaqué à ses occupations de maire dès hier matin, rien ne laissait présager un tel drame. La ville en deuil, Isabelle Thomas.
Nevers s'est éveillé ce matin sous une pluie incessante, un ciel de deuil à l'image d'une ville entière plongée dans la stupeur et l'émotion. Pierre Bérégovoy était maire de Nevers depuis 10 ans. Aujourd'hui, les drapeaux de l'hôtel de ville sont en berne.
The entire nation was stunned. Every television station, every newspaper, every radio broadcast carried the same headline. The people of France spoke in hushed tones, unable to believe what they were hearing. To the public, it was a tragedy. But to those who knew just how twisted and deadly French politics is, it was something else entirely. Not just a loss, but the final act in a much more complicated system. One that involved class, power, and a secretive system of privilege that had been running France for centuries. Pierre's beginnings were anything but privileged. Born in 1925 to Ukrainian immigrants, he didn't have access to the usual things that most aristocrats had, such as books or tutors. Instead, he had to do hard, physical, unforgiving work. When his father became gravely ill, Pierre was still just a boy. He had no choice but to leave school and work in a textile factory to earn enough money to take care of both of them. While other children learned history and literature, Pierre learned the grit of the factory floor. The sound of machines became his classroom, and the labor movement became his university. He rose through union ranks not by privilege, but all thanks to persistence. He spoke for workers because he was one of them. His voice carried, so much so that it eventually reached the ears of François Mitterrand, the man who would become France's first socialist president. With Mitterrand's backing, Pierre became mayor of Nevers, a modest city far from Paris. Locals called him the good uncle. He was approachable, humble, and grounded. Not the type of man you'd expect to rise to the top of French politics. But in 1992, against every expectation, the boy who had once traded his classroom for a factory floor walked into the Prime Minister's office. Pierre didn't arrive in office quietly. At his inauguration, he did something almost unheard of in French politics. He stood before Parliament and accused members of the elite of lining their pockets through illegal means. And then, in a move that stunned the chamber, he raised a sheet of paper and hinted that it contained names.
On soupçonne certains hommes publics de s'être enrichis personnellement de manière illégale. S'ils sont innocents, ils doivent être disculpés. S'ils sont coupables, ils doivent être châtiés. Dans tous les cas, la justice doit passer. Mais je voudrais être plus clair encore. J'entends vider l'abcès de la corruption. J'ai ici une liste de personnalités dont je pourrais éventuellement vous parler. Je m'en garderai bien.
He didn't just take a shot at the very class that had controlled France for generations. His main objective was to revive the economy in a fragile post-Cold War world and, above all, cleanse French politics of corruption. But to most of the corrupt officials, it was a declaration of war. And in France, declaring war on the elite has never ended well. Less than a year later, everything came crashing down. The satirical weekly Le Canard Enchaîné published a story that shook Pierre's career to its core. The article revealed that he had borrowed 1 million francs interest-free from a wealthy businessman. On paper, the facts were clean. The loan was legal, it was signed before a notary, it had been repaid in full. No fraud, no crime. But in politics, facts matter far less than perception. The businessman in question, Roger Patrice Polat, wasn't just anyone. He was a close friend of President Mitterrand and had been involved in one of the biggest insider trading scandals of the 1980s. By linking Pierre to Polat, the story painted him with the same brush of corruption he had promised to wipe out. The timing couldn't have been worse. The headline dropped just weeks before national elections. Newspapers were quick to cover the story. Television debates started. Rival parties pounced on each other, framing the loan not as a legal question, but a moral one. If Pierre, the man who had sworn to fight corruption, had accepted money from a tainted businessman, what did that make him?
Je ne vois pas pourquoi je serais convoqué par le juge, mais si je devais être convoqué, j'irais l'esprit tranquille. J'ai accepté ce prêt sans intérêt parce qu'il m'était proposé par un ami, ce qui prouvait que je n'avais pas, disons, les moyens d'acheter mon appartement aisément. Cela étant, j'étais à l'époque, permettez-moi de le rappeler, député de l'opposition, je ne pouvais dispenser aucune faveur. Et je le répète, jamais...
When the votes were counted, it was not just a defeat, it was a collapse. From 269 seats, the Socialists were left with just 53. In one election, they lost 216 seats, the greatest fall in modern French history. It was as if an entire party had been wiped off the map. Pierre resigned as prime minister. The man who had dared to point fingers at the powerful had been taken down by one well-timed scandal. After stepping down, Pierre returned to Nevers. The city where his journey had begun now became his retreat. Publicly, he kept quiet. Privately, friends saw a man weighed down by shame. He avoided the spotlight. His once warm presence grew cold. Meetings were shorter, conversations briefer. The humiliation was complete. The whispers did not stop. For every headline that faded, there were whispers in back rooms, in bars, in political circles. Was Pierre really clean? Or was he just like the rest of them? Depression settled in. His life's work and integrity now seemed like they'd been damaged beyond repair. And then came May 1st, 1993. The very day France celebrated Labor Day, the day workers were honored, Pierre left Having home and drove to a quiet riverside spot outside Nevers. With him was a revolver taken from one of his bodyguards. By the water's edge, he lifted it to his head and pulled the trigger. When the news finally hit the mainstream media, the rest of the country was left to ask why. Did he commit suicide due to the scandal? Or perhaps because he couldn't bear the shame of it any longer? Or was he simply crushed, not just by politics, but by a system that had never truly accepted him? The media faced backlash, as people believed that if they had not made a mountain out of a molehill, Pierre might not have started overthinking, and eventually decided that the best way out was to take his life. At his funeral, President François Mitterrand delivered a line that cut deep. It was unpardonable that his honor was thrown to the dogs. Some believed it was an attack on the press. Others believed it was something more.
Toutes les explications du monde ne justifieront pas qu'on ait pu livrer aux chiens l'honneur d'un homme et finalement sa vie.
An acknowledgement that Pierre had never been part of the inner circle, and that when he tried to rise against it, he paid the price. Pierre's death was more than a personal tragedy. It revealed the architecture of French power and the walls that keep outsiders out. At the heart of that architecture stood the Grandes Écoles system. These schools weren't ordinary universities. They were pipelines. Pipelines to ministries, pipelines to the courts, pipelines to the boardrooms of France's biggest companies. On paper, France had free public education. In reality, Grandes Écoles existed in a separate world. Most of their students came from wealthy families, children of executives, professionals, political dynasties. Getting in required years of special preparation, the kind of preparation only the privileged could afford. Once inside, the graduates formed tight-knit networks. They hired each other, promoted each other, and protected each other. By the end of the 20th century, half of France's CEOs and most of its top ministers, judges, and civil servants had graduated from just a handful of these schools. The message was clear. To rise in France, you needed to belong to the circle. Pierre never had. The bitter irony was that the Grandes Écoles were born out of revolution. In 1789, the French Revolution promised to end privilege. No more aristocracy, no more closed circles. Education, they declared, would be free and equal. But revolutions rarely ever work out as planned. War broke out. The Republic needed trained officers, engineers, administrators. Schools like the École Polytechnique were founded to serve the nation. Yet, over time, those very schools began to look less like doors to equality and more like the new gates of privilege. By the 19th century, the aristocracy of titles and bloodlines had quietly given way to an aristocracy of education, one where networks and diplomas mattered more than noble lineage. The dream of fairness faded, replaced by a structure that was just as exclusive, only dressed in different clothes. And so, by the time Pierre Bérégovoy made his climb to power, the fortress of the French elite was not just intact, it was much stronger than ever. Fast forward to the present day. The faces in power may appear younger, more diverse, and more modern, but the scaffolding holding them up has hardly changed. Presidents, prime ministers, judges, and CEOs glance at their resumes, and again the same few schools appear, like a secret watermark of legitimacy. Consider this. By the early 2000s, more than 90% of France's senior judges hailed from just one school, the École Nationale d'Administration, better known as ENA. One institution shaping nearly the entire judiciary. To outsiders, it felt less like a coincidence and more like an impenetrable wall. That wall held firm until 2018, when simmering resentment finally erupted onto the streets. What began as frustration over a fuel tax, marketed as an environmental measure, quickly spiraled into something far larger. It was at this point that a rally was held known as the Yellow Vests, an uprising of ordinary citizens who felt like they were being denied opportunities due to their poor background, and ignored by a political class that seemed more interested in preserving itself than in listening to the people. People weren't just angry about gas prices. They were pissed off about the inequality and the suspicion that those in charge lived in a completely different world from everyone else. And at the center of it stood Emmanuel Macron, himself a proud graduate of ENA. In response to the unrest, Macron promised change. In 2021, he announced that ENA would be shut down, calling it nothing less than a symbol of privilege. The move made headlines, and on paper, it sounded like a revolution. But when the new school opened, critics looked closer and saw something familiar. Different name, different packaging, but the same old doors leading to the same old networks. For many, it felt less like the fall of the fortress and more like a renovation. Pierre Bérégovoy's story was never just a political biography. It was a mirror that shows the rural truth of how French politics operates. He wasn't born into the circle. He had no golden key. He clawed his way up from the outside and proved that the barriers could, at least for a moment, be breached. But when he tried to challenge the very system that had let him in, the system closed ranks. It chewed him up, and in the end, it swallowed him whole. 3 decades later, his legacy leaves a haunting question. Is it truly possible for an outsider to survive inside the iron grip of France's elite? Or is Bérégovoy's death a warning that has been rearing its ugly head over the past few years, that any common folk who decides to break past the barrier in French politics may find the walls closing in around them?